Okay, thanks everybody. It's hard to compete against a coffee break. Only thing worse is competing against lunch. So I'm here to talk about the role of economics in government agencies and how we see the world in terms of being able to influence, inform policy. And that'll be the key word here. So I'm going to talk about 5 different components here. First, what's the role to be policy informing? We walk up to the line. We are not providing policy advice. There's another guy at USDA does that. That's the Office of the Chief Economist. They're in a different structure within USDA, and that's the group that gives advice to the secretary and beyond. We walk up to that line, say, this is what we think you want to know, go ahead. I'll talk about how our analysis and data are used by policymakers and others. We have an active staff analysis program. I'll describe what that is. That's the vehicle by which we inform policy folks. And also talk about ERS as a federal statistical agency. There are 13 of them in the US. We have a highly decentralized system for national statistics, unlike most countries. But we talk a lot with one another. ERS is one of those 13 federal statistical agencies. And I'll talk about our reports and data products and how they relate to current agendas and what's going forward. So with that, I'm not going to have any charts or figures of what sub-Saharan Africa is looking like or California. Prop 12, although I did do a calculation to see how big a cubicle would be if given that the 116 square inches for a layer that's proposed, I believe, in Florida. That's like a 5x5 cubicle for maybe an average ERS person. So if that's a metric, I mean, Rich, was making his square footage comparisons. I'll give mine. So as I mentioned, focus here is on being policy informing. So we want to have the capacity to deal with 2 sides, the emerging issues as well as anticipating trends. And here I can give an example. We had the infant formula crisis of last year that's still lingering. Well, who knew that 4 firms produce 90% of infant formula? Well, actually, we knew that. We did a report on that about 11 years ago. Who knew that just over 50% of households using infant formula were WIC households? In general, in aggregate, it's 40%, but WIC households account for over 50% of those households. Yeah, we knew that. We did that. We developed that methodology. Infant formula crisis emerges. We're able to kind of take what we understand about that industry, bring new data with that we have available through data acquisitions, purchases of data, and able to start to see what's the profile look like. HHS was running that show, and they're looking at the U.S. in aggregate. Well, the Food and Nutrition Service said, well, what about the WIC families? Are they getting access to the formula? Because that formula actually has a slightly different kind of recipe formulation. It's higher in iron, a little higher in calories. And so we were able to generate, the data and information of where where the stocking rates are, and inform policymakers on what progress we're making there. So that's a good example of how we were kind of anticipating trends and being able to inform emerging issues. So economics here is providing the information data, and we do a bunch of analysis as well, right? And these are all forms of evidence. As a federal statistical agency, not many of these agencies focus on analysis. Mostly they're focusing on measurement. We're doing both. And we try to do this in a focus really on doing it in a neutral manner. So We stay positive. No normative statements are coming out of us, out of our reports or out of our staff analyses. So we're not here to influence the decision other than providing objective information and analysis. So this is, the economic story is a fairly important part of a lot of the policy making going on, certainly in this administration. From what I can, I just have a short tenure in my position. I've been in 3 years now, and it's been very dependent on ERS analysis. So, how our data and analyses are used here to inform policy. So we have a number of different places where we touch. Within USDA, we're working across mission areas. Our work helps inform the activities going on in Food Nutrition Service. We're working with rural development on a lot of broadband-related issues. We provide a lot of support to OCE, almost any chart and graph you see that they put up, it'll be something from an ERS report. Across the state, well, let's say even across U.S. government even, should mention, we are supporting work going on in the Department of Defense, doing work on food security in military families, veterans, for veterans as well. We're also doing work out with the FDA. We've done work with National Institute of Health, looking at poverty measures and correlating areas of poverty with cancer rates. We're supporting their work there. So we do a number of different things here in that regard. We also support state, local legislatures. We have work, states are using our data for lots of their internal analyses to how they allocate resources within the state for development funds. Internationally, we're highly engaged with the OECD. We have a couple of interesting projects ongoing, as well as supporting a lot of their joint working parties. So, and then we also work with the public. Farmers and ranchers use our data, NGOs take our data, certainly folks in academia access data from us. Agribusiness groups want to look at issues related to equipment sales, and so and the media as well. And if you watched CNN last Sunday, they used one of our charts of note on it was National Eat an Ice Cream Sunday Day or something like that. So our some of our work on ice cream consumption over the last 20 years. So staff analyses, these are quick requests, factual data, lots of times, or some of our reports that have just come out. Also, I'll include in their briefings. Some of it is a what-if analysis on these front burner issues. And we had a report came out by one of our colleagues here in the room, Jim McDonald, and his colleagues at ERS on competition and consolidation in U.S. food and agriculture, and very well received report. I highly recommend it. It's really a primer on these issues. So this type of research tries to be germane to the conversation, and that's part of our ability to anticipate these trends, listening to what's going on. It's a lot of engagement with stakeholders and within USDA and maybe across federal government that helps inform that agenda. So timely research, this is our challenge. Coming to USDA and ERS, folks ask me, what's the difference after being nearly 40 years in the university environment? And one is, everyone knows the mission, and there's one mission. It's demand-driven. It's focused on being relevant and being timely. And so some of these timely activities we've engaged in, timely issues here, there's a list. COVID-19, what did we do? Well, fairly quickly, we stood up an expedited paper series. We called it the COVID Working Papers. It had a quicker turnaround review time. We've put out about 25 of those. That's being sunsetted now. But that was one way we tried to address the emerging issues. The census also stepped up right away with what they refer to as the pulse surveys. We acquired additional data to track sales, retail sales and food establishment sales weekly. We normally would get that data at the end of the year, but we contracted to get it more frequently. So we can track the movements of consumers in response to the COVID-19. And we looked at a number of different issues related to COVID-19. But we had a new vehicle here to help us expedite the analysis. And I'll tell you, in general, when we talk about ERS reports, there is no book, no journal article out there that is more thoroughly reviewed than an ERS product, period, without question. And to the frustration of some of my colleagues here, but that's the world that we live in. That's how careful we are, because it is not like a journal article that comes out that would have a disclaimer at the bottom. These are the views of the authors, do not represent the views of USDA or the federal government. No, when it comes out as a ERS report, that's an official government document. That's representing the views of USDA in this case. Russia-Ukraine situation, right? Well, lots of folks are tracking trade flows, and all of you know what those numbers are like. 25% of the traded wheat is coming out of this region. Where is it going? It's going to the poorest parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. Where we add value is looking at international food security, and we do an international food security assessment every year. It comes out late August, maybe September, and we got back to work on that report to try to incorporate what's the impact of this conflict going forward. And so that was a pretty big lift to take into account an emerging issue on a long-standing product that we put out. I mentioned the infant formula in the International Food Security Assessment. So those were a couple of themes here that we've been doing work on. So those are examples of timely work that we try to get out. ERS is a data evidence building agency. I think that's how we see the whole federal statistical system. We have a new, recent law act passed, the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking, 2018, which really called to revamp aspects of how we deal with let's call it the protected information and identifiable information, PII data, and trying to make it more available to the public and other users. One of our products that involves confidential information is ARMS. Everyone knows probably the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. We started that up in, over 25 years ago, the mid-90s. And it's surveying over 30,000 farms, and it's a primary source of information, not just on production practices, how resources are used, what the output trends are, but also looking at the economic well-being of farms and farm households. All farm income is collected there. We put out a report on farm income 3 times a year, but it's used heavily within 2 major divisions of ERS here. Cost of production data is coming out of there. We get requests to look at what's the distribution of farm income by farm size. This is an important issue for the secretary. We can give them those numbers quite quickly. What we call food apps, it's a food acquisition purchase survey. This is a survey that we stood up with Food and Nutrition Service. It's about 3,000 households. It's a food diary, but it's tracking not just what they purchase, but also how they acquire it, whether through SNAP, And we're going to expand, we're looking to expand the survey, redo it again to include school lunch programs, other points that consumers acquire food, and link it to food nutrition database that's available in Ag Research Service. So, but the idea is to look at how this influences choices. The Food and Nutrition Service finds this incredibly helpful because they're the ones who are in charge of the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That is a $90 billion a year budget item. When we start talking about the Farm Bill and looking at a Farm Bill of 1.3 trillion, I'm not making up the number, just over 1 trillion of that is food assistance programs. So being able to provide timely, objective analysis there is important, certainly. A new data product we put up is the Survey of Irrigation Organizations. And this is something that has been done in over 40 years. And it's looking at 2,600 of these organizations in the Midwest and Far West. And we have several reports out on that. It's a data product that's up and available. And I'll talk about a little bit later about how to acquire some of these data products. And then productivity was a topic here in the first two talks. We have an agricultural productivity, two databases, a domestic database, and we have a international database. Both are highly regarded by colleagues within the U.S. and internationally. And someone's going to ask me if we're going to have state-level data. Someone going to ask that question? No? Okay, so I won't anticipate it, but I have an answer if you want to ask that question. On the international productivity database, it's being used by the OECD. It's being used by the European Commission as well. And so we have a lot of pickup there, and we're collaborating with those folks on some projects going forward. So I mentioned being a federal statistical agency. So as I prepared to come into my role, I spent part of the summer reading what's called the Purple Book. It's Principles and Practices of a Federal Statistical Agency. It's a little dry reading. You don't sit down in one stop and go through it. But its focus is on what are the responsibilities of a federal statistical agency. And these three words that are bold here are just the hallmark of being a federal statistical agency. We focus on quality, objectivity, transparency. It's about providing trusted data. And that's the core of what we do. And we see this also as being a trusted partner here in providing data, because it also builds trust in government. And we need the trust from, say, farmers to provide us the data that we're using it the way we say we're going to use it. We need to have the trust of folks on the other end that trust us to digest the data, curate it, do analyses, and put that out. And so being trusted is the core of what we do. You can acquire these data too. We can talk about that to do analysis. But that's our focus here. And how do we stay focused on these tasks and being objective and being trusted? And so you can see who all the other players are, the other 13 statistical agencies. It includes Census, of course, Bureau of Economic Analysis. Those folks Bureau of Economic Analysis does not do a lot of analysis as such. They do a lot of measurement. NSF is in there with the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. Those are the folks who track how many doctorates are coming out in a given area over time. Social Security Administration, really, with the Survey of Income, very popular data product. And of course, NAS with the Agricultural Census and 400 other data products they put out a year is another key partner. So I use the term that we are a data and evidence building agency. So access, transparency, we have this trilemma, right? We want to provide accurate data, we want it to be accessible, and we want to maintain confidentiality. You can't optimize all three. I'll give you an example. I can get you more accurate data if we use something called Title 13, Title 26 data, which is basically gleaned from your IRS filings, what you state as income. Right? But if you want to have access to that, you're going to have to go to a research data center run by the Federal Statistical System. Right? That's a seat that costs $20,000. You have to travel to the physical facility. It limits access. So you get greater accuracy, access is limited. How do we maintain confidentiality? It's really critical in terms of the trust story I mentioned. But we're starting to look at ways to open up access, and we have a new access regulation that's being developed. And we're going to be talking more heavily about shared responsibility. The users will have responsibility that these data are accessed appropriately. We have three kinds of risks we worry about. Disclosure risk, that's when we screw up. Re-identification risks, when you screw up. And then reputation to the agency. That's a key consideration here in terms of these data products. So we look at data here as both a product and there's a process in terms of innovation. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And this is a project we've been engaged in. And so we're looking at two different data products. So we're looking specifically right now, we're looking at ARMS, and we're looking at something called the Rural Urban Continuum Codes. So I described what ARMS is. The Rural Urban Continuum Codes is a geographic classification system, what's urban, what's rural, metro counties, non-metro counties, and it goes into a finer categorization than what census does. Who uses these data, those codes? Well, a lot of government, USDA agencies for doling out money for rural development programs. The Federal Office of Health Policy uses it to decide who's going to be, who should get special grants because they're in geographically disadvantaged areas. They use it. We don't tell them what to do. They take it and they use it. There's a massive community out there that's using these data that are outside of ag and food. It's the public health arena is using this. So if you went on Google Scholar, I found like 66 hits on this. When we did a survey using natural language processing, an early study, we found 500 articles are drawing on these data. So we're trying to see who is using our data. And this is going to help us drive how we're going to make investments in data, because I consider data one of our key assets. After people, human capital, data is what we spend the most money on. It's about 20% of the budget. It also influences congressional decision making. There was a request, not too long ago about what's the distribution of farm assets by classification of size, and because they're thinking about it for tax policy. So a lot of folks use these data. I just kind of give you this is how we kind of conceptualize this whole data space. We have lots of inputs, a lot of effort going into it that you could see. We put it into like a production function, our activities. We then generate outputs, reports, but we can also generate a number of other outputs. We can create networks. We can create stronger communities of access. And then there are outcomes. And outcomes are like the precursor to impact. And so how do we get respondents to comply more and participate more frequently? Policymakers trying to make evidence-based decisions and starting to look at our connections to interdependent systems, right? Because, my case, my perspective from ERS is it's not just about the food system that we normally think of, but we also interact with the environment system. We also interact with the health system. And societal preferences are part of that. And so we're operating in this swirl of competing interests. And these are our challenges for policy going forward. I also, kind of wonder about what's the value of public data. After I spend, I mentioned 20% of the budget on data, what's our return on that? And that's a hard one to look at. There are a lot of costs involved, and there are risks. With risks, also, we have to balance it against rewards. Everyone's got a cell phone here. The risks of providing all that information, but you take it on because you think the value of doing that is important. How do we start to look at both the real value to society as well as the option value here? And so these are, special goods. They offer special public goods. They offer special challenges here to us. So I'm not going to show you this. This is we engaged in a workshop recently on democratizing the data. And we brought 22 folks together in Kansas City to look at a couple of our data platforms. And they could look at dashboards. We had something called Juniper Notebooks, which is a platform for coding to access different data products you might be interested in. And what happened is you had people all of a sudden discovering who these communities are of accessing data that you didn't know before. And what it's done is, it really had the value of lowering the costs, lowering the barriers to accessing data. And so some of the early lessons we learned that we're going to build on include from folks, they say, hey, put more data up. Okay, everyone wants more, especially when it doesn't cost them anything. That's their favorite price, free. Also looking to combine data with GIS sources. Expand the corpus, just not from the scholarly literature, but also think tank reports, white papers, congressional reports, and how to engage the community here. And so this is a particularly important opportunity to get minority serving institutions access to it. Given that we've lowered the barriers, they can come and play as well. And so, when I see that part, we have a DEIA agenda at USDA, diversity, equity, inclusion, access. This is about the I and the A. It's about inclusion, getting folks to see who's in that network, identify networks, and A is access, right? So it's just not about watching who's playing. It's also getting on the field and playing. So we have a number of ERS reports we put out, about 70 a year. We have 80 publicly available data products, another 5 or 6 confidential private information data products that you can access. I mentioned how rigorous our reports are. Sometimes they're too long. After supervising 35 theses and served on another 100 committees, I thought I was done reading dissertation-length products. I probably read more in the last 3 years than I did in the prior 37. I'll mention our DEIA agenda, how we are operationalized. It's just not a workforce agenda in terms of how do we kind of take policy and take some action on it. We have a number of activities here on racial, social equity research, looking at heirs property, looking at a whole range of things. I'm probably running out of time because Gall's standing here. We created a partnership here with the AAEA to help build that pipeline. It's a multi-year partnership, and hopefully we'll start, this is finishing out the first year. And we also have the Interagency Technical Working Group on Race and Ethnicity that's being run out of OMB, how we start to look at categorizing and classifying all these different ethnic groups and race categories in terms of informing our research and how we collect data. So data accessibility, one other aspect, we put all this money into data. We have data training webinars. We get a lot of pickup on a lot of these topics. You can see them there. There's a standard application process to access the confidential data, not just ours, any in the whole system. There's one form now that you can use to go through that. And an example of a partnership we've engaged in is Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They put up the money, nearly $1.5 million. We provided access to the grant recipients for data. And so that's a pretty helpful activity. So I'll just, to wrap it up, I want to focus, role of the government agency is to be relevant and be timely, focus on being objective, want to be that trusted voice for data and analysis, and communication, not just focus on output, try to focus on outcomes, be relevant, talk to internal stakeholders, talk to external stakeholders, share that information, and I think in the last 3 years we've really heightened that activity dramatically. So with that, I'll have my shameless self-promotion here at ERS. Lots of ways you can interact with our work. So thanks a lot, and I'm happy to take questions.